Hello everyone, and welcome to the next in our series of Sociology 111 statewide synchronous sessions. Today we're going to be covering Chapter 9 on stratification and social inequality, and Chapter 10, global inequality. So we'll begin with Chapter 9. Stratification and social mobility in the United States. All right. We're going to be looking at systems of stratification today, sociological perspectives on stratification. Is stratification universal? Do we find it in every culture? Stratification by class, income and wealth, poverty, life chances, and social mobility. Finally, we might take a brief look at social policy and stratification when we think about something like executive compensation. Okay. Is social inequality an inescapable part of society? How does government policy affect the life chances of the working poor? Is this country still a place where a hard-working person can move up the social ladder? These are some of the questions we're going to be trying to answer during our discussion today. Stratification and social mobility in the United States. Social inequality is a condition in which people don't have the same amount of stuff. Social inequality refers to the conditions between individuals. All right? They have different amounts of wealth, prestige, or power, giving them different standing in society. Wealth, of course, is the totality of possessions. That's your income plus all your assets minus your debt. Prestige is a ranking largely in the U.S. based upon occupation. Power is simply the ability to get done what you want to get done, despite any obstacles someone may put in your way. Stratification is when you look at the structured hierarchy that exists within a society. It's a system of ranking for people. In the United States of America, you may hear frequently talked about upper, middle, and lower class. So we have a class-based system of stratification. One of the things that stratification does is stratification means there are different opportunities, different resource levels. Essentially, people have different amounts of rewards and power within a society. Income, of course, I discussed. That's simply what you make in a year, your salary and wages. Other things that might be included in income would be interest on investments, rent from property owned, dividends paid on stocks owned. Wealth encompasses all of a person's material assets. So where your income might be interest paid on investments, the investments themselves count as part of your wealth. You may get rent from property owned, and that's part of your income. The property itself is part of your wealth. It also would encompass things like technological devices you own, car, jewelry, precious metals, things like that, minus any debts you may possess, like if you have student loans, if you have credit card debt, anything like that. Wealth is actually all of a person's assets minus all of a person's debt to give you the total they have in terms of wealth. I mentioned prestige. Within society, if you remember back to our discussion on roles and status, there are two different types of status that contribute to a person's standing. We have ascribed status and achieved status. Examples of ascribed status might include gender, race, ethnicity, disability status, sexual orientation, depending upon how you view that, whether you view that as a choice or as something you're born with. Psychology and psychologists tend to now view sexual orientation as something you're born with. Being a child of parents, being a sibling, it's a social position assigned a person by society without regard for the person's unique talents or characteristics. Achieved status and that should be achieved status. There's a D missing there. It's a social position that a person attains through their own efforts. So, for example, me being a professor here at Ivy Tech, that was something I had to work towards. Me being a graduate school graduate, having a master's degree, that's an achieved status as well. People who achieve doctorates, that's an achieved status. Even being married is an achieved status. Being a parent is an achieved status. But it's something you work towards, something that you try to achieve. And that's the difference between ascribed and achieved status. So what types of stratification systems do we have? We have slavery, where essentially an individual is reduced to the status of property. They are completely without personal individual status in society. Their status is that of property. They're owned by other people. Caste, this is what you would find in Hindu society in India. It's a very rigid system. Hereditary plays into this. Religion plays into this. They tend to be fixed and immobile. If you're born in a particular caste, like the untouchable caste, you work at a job that is for untouchable caste people. Your friends are all within the same caste. You marry within that caste. Your children are born within that caste, and you die within that caste. You really don't have any chance of getting out of that particular caste. Estate system, they say feudalism there. Estate is essentially when you have a mixture of class and caste. If we look at modern England, it is possible to increase in standing in society by being successful in making money. You can raise your class. However, you can never become more than a minor member of the nobility, the knighthood from the queen, that kind of thing. You cannot become a duke or a duchess. It's a mixture of caste and class. They have hereditary ranks, but they also have class-based or economic-based ranks as well. Class system, which is what we have here in the United States of America, social ranking based on economic achievement. If you accumulate wealth, income and wealth, you move up in class. If you lose income and wealth, you move down in class. The difference between a caste system and a class system is essentially the potential for social mobility. Social mobility is simply whether or not you can move up and down in a system of stratification. There tends to be potential for social mobility in a class-based system and not so much in a caste-based system. Now, in an estate system, there is potential for social mobility within the class-based portion of it. Yes, there were peasants. Yes, serfs were actually attached to the land. But there were also tradespeople, and some of those tradespeople and merchants could achieve influence and power through the accumulation of wealth. In 1997, a 5-class model to describe the U.S. class system was created by this researcher right here. We have the upper class, upper middle class, lower middle class, working class, and lower class. Technically, there are 9 strata within the class-based system in the U.S. You do have upper, middle, and lower levels within. There's actually an upper class, middle upper class, lower upper class, upper middle class, middle class, lower middle class, upper lower class, middle lower class, and lower class. And also there's another term, the underclass, which is sometimes used to describe anybody living in poverty. Working class, while it tends to range between lower middle class and upper lower class, is more about the type of work you do than it is about a particular income level. While it is true that a lot of working class people exist on the upper fringes of the lower class and the lower fringes of the upper class, and there is a range in there. Working class is really more about the type of work you do. And it's the difference between white-collar work and blue-collar work. Blue-collar work, which is working with your hands, is what working-class jobs are all about. So, 1 to 2% of the U.S. population is upper class. There are some race effects within that. When you look at the lower upper class, which is where people who rely primarily on income rather than wealth for the majority of their economic power, tends to be more dominated by minority groups. The upper class itself, which is less than 0.5% of the U.S. population, tends to be overwhelmingly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Lower class, 10 to 25% of the U.S. population. This includes a lot of people who are what we categorize as the working poor, people who work 40 or more hours a week, but still struggle with meeting all of their daily needs. Upper middle class, 10 to 15% of the U.S. population, roughly incomes between $100,000 and about $180,000 a year, puts you into the upper middle class. Lower middle class, 30 to 35% of the U.S. population, anywhere below roughly $45,000, somewhere between $25,000 and $45,000 a year, puts you into this particular category, depending on how many people live in the household. A single person living on $25,000 a year really is kind of lower middle class. A family of 4, no, they're lower class. Working class, 40 to 45% of the U.S. population. These are people who work service, manufacturing jobs. And when we talk about working class, as I said, we're talking more about really more about the type of work you do, although the overwhelming majority of working class jobs exist somewhere within the lower middle class and the upper lower class. So, right now you may have heard that the middle class is vanishing out of the U.S. society. What are some of the things that are making this happen? Well, one is if you don't have an education anymore, it's hard to find a good paying job. The high paying secure jobs in our economy that really would be described as middle class jobs exist in the information technologies, and increasingly you need a degree to work in information technologies. Computer systems programming, game design, even education is information technology driven anymore. Look at what we're doing right here. We're doing a virtual classroom lecture. So you really have to have some education to be middle class anymore. A high school diploma just really doesn't cut it for another reason. There's global competition for jobs in manufacturing. A lot of the manufacturing jobs that used to exist here in the U.S. have been taken over to other countries. Advances in technology, growing dependence on a temporary workforce. A lot of jobs, even if you manage to find a job that pays substantially, pays good money, more than minimum wage, substantially more than minimum wage, a lot of times those are temporary jobs, or you're considered an independent contractor. You're not actually hired and given benefits. Rise of new growth industries and non-union workplaces. Auto manufacturing is no longer dominated by the unions. If you work for one of the big 3 in Detroit, yes, the unions still dominate there. But there's a new rust belt developing in the South, and wages are substantially lower there, in large part because they're not unionized. They tend to run an average of $10 an hour lower than the rates in Ford, GM, Chrysler, which are located in Detroit, where the UAW still has a very strong presence. But like a lot of the import cars, Hyundai, Honda, Nissan, Toyota, have factories throughout the southern states. And there's not a lot of unionization. In fact, there's almost no unionization there. So, when we think about sociologists looking at stratification and the perspectives on stratification, there's a lot of debate over this. There's difference of opinion. There's theoretical approaches that are different as far as stratification and social inequality in society. Karl Marx, who everybody's probably heard of, wrote the Communist Manifesto, really believed that the significant shift in society that happened that created social inequality in our society as it exists, and what capitalism is kind of founded on, is the shift from feudalism to industrialization. Marx essentially sees two classes in society: the owners of capital and the laborers. For him, this conflict exists between the capitalists, the owners of the means of production, the people with the money and the power, who he referred to as the bourgeoisie, and the laborers, the workers, the people working the jobs, working at the factories, whatever particular type of factory it may be. And if you look at fast food, that's essentially factory work according to Marx's definition. He called these people the proletariat. Social relations depend on control. And who controls a society? The person who controls the factories, controls the businesses, controls the corporations, controls what Marx referred to as the primary means of production. When Marx was writing, we were really beginning to see factory work, along the lines of the factories that Ford created. But these were in England, and they were earlier. There were textile factories, carpentry factories. And so Marx really saw social relations as determined by the conflict between the owners and the workers in an industrial society. Capitalism, means of productions, are held by private individuals and operated for profit. Okay? And Marx believes that capitalism fosters social inequality. And industrialization may somewhat lead to capitalism. The bourgeoisie, which I mentioned, they're the owners. And the proletariat, the laborers, the people who work in the factory. What Marx believed would happen is that the proletariat would develop what he called class consciousness. Essentially, all the workers at some point in time would look around, see all the other workers just as miserable as they are, enjoying not enjoying, but living in the same kind of conditions. And so there would become this collective identification and empathization with each other. And the workers would rise up, overthrow the system, and establish the truly classless communist society. Part of the reason Marx fell into favor, of course, is his revolution never really materialized. Part of the reason for that, according to some neo-Marxists, is the idea of false consciousness, which is when you get people to essentially believe that their interests align with the powerful in society. So it's not accurate. When we think about the idea of lowering taxes on corporations, anybody who is a worker who votes for this, according to Marx, has false consciousness because they believe that lowering taxes on the corporations and the billionaires benefits everybody in society. It's pardon me, from an economic standpoint, Marx would say that's simply not true. If you're making less than $250,000 a year, having a higher sliding scale tax rate actually benefits people who make less money because it gives the government more money to provide for them. Taxes in and of themselves are essentially a wealth redistribution mechanism. It's a way of taking wealth away from those who have it and redistributing it to those who need it. So, Max Weber had a little bit different view. Marx viewed the economy as the foundation of a society. It's what drove the shape of the society. If you have a capitalist economy, that shapes the nature of social relations for people in your entire society. Weber had a little bit different view. If you ever heard the term socioeconomic status, that comes out of the work of Max Weber. Weber said that regardless of how much money you have, that's not the only thing that determines your status or your position within the stratification system. Class in and of itself is just a group of people who have a similar level of wealth and income. But opposed to this is the idea Weber had of status group, people who share a similar level of social prestige and may share certain characteristics of a similar lifestyle. For example, when you look at prestige attached to jobs, white-collar jobs tend to have higher levels of prestige, and prestige is essentially the social standing that people attach to a particular occupation. High prestige is better, low prestige, not quite so good, of course. The highest prestige group of jobs in the U.S. are the group of jobs referred to collectively as doctor. Surgeons rank at the top in the U.S., which is kind of a reversal of where it is in England, because in the U.S., surgeons rank higher than general practitioners. In England, general practitioners actually rank higher in prestige than surgeons. So the group of doctors is at the top. Then you would have the group referred to as lawyers. And there are, within each of these, of course, you can break it down, and there are different varying levels of prestige. Judges tend to have higher prestige, but they tend to come almost exclusively from the ranks of lawyers because they need to have a knowledge of the law. Following that is college professors. Now, being a college professor myself, and I'm not saying college professors don't earn a good living, but nowhere near the living that doctors and lawyers earn. However, because we're highly educated and there's a value attached to our labor in society, when you think about meeting as social equals, college professors tend to run in a lot of similar circles with lawyers, doctors, business owners, people who may have higher levels of wealth. And so that's why Weber said it's more than just your economic standing that determines your position in society. It's also really power plays into that as well. And sometimes you can acquire power through the social networks you have. And even if you're not making as much money as some people in your social network, because you know them, that may increase your power in a particular society. Okay. Symbolic interactionism, which looks at the individual actions and the meanings behind those, takes a little bit different view of stratification. Thorsten Veblen had this idea of what he called conspicuous consumption. And it's essentially the idea that you don't just purchase goods because you need them or because you want them. Certain things you purchase to display your affluence. When we think about it from a purely pragmatic standpoint or utilitarian standpoint, What is the difference between owning a Toyota and owning a Mercedes-Benz? You may talk slight differences in quality, but if we look at what a car is supposed to do from a utilitarian perspective, a Toyota gets you from point A to point B almost as well as a Mercedes does, okay? So why do you buy the Mercedes? Veblen says you buy the Mercedes as a status symbol, okay? And some cars actually are not even mechanically as reliable. We look at a car like Jaguar, which historically has had a lot of mechanical problems and is hard to actually keep on the road. Why would you buy a Jaguar instead of a Toyota, which tends to be one of the most reliable cars out there? To flaunt your superior wealth and social standing. What's the difference between a Rolex and a Timex? Rolex may be slightly better as far as quality goes, but Timex is a very good watch that keeps time, and they used to have the commercial takes a licking and keeps on ticking to demonstrate that for $30 you could have a watch that would keep time very accurately and was durable as well. So why do you buy the Rolex? In order to, according to Veblen, show your conspicuous purchases. Another thing, cruises, taking a cruise, that tends to be a very expensive activity. It's not something that just everybody can afford. But saying, well, I cruise the Mediterranean, that's what Veblen would call conspicuous leisure. He had even more of an idea about it, though, in that, what they call the leisure class are people that have accumulated enough wealth that they don't actually have to work. My mom knows a couple. She's real good friends with them. They do nothing but take river cruises in Europe and ocean cruises. That's all they do. They really just cruise around the world. They're only home in San Antonio maybe a couple months out of the year. So, conspicuous leisure. One of the things, I've heard cruises can be nice, but I've also heard that they can be very cramped and very, like claustrophobic for some people. Or, going skiing. This is kind of conspicuous vacationing, as it were. So, one of the other things that Veblen had an idea about is what was contained in the term nouveau riche in France. People who accumulated wealth without accumulating the cultural attitudes of wealthy people. You may have seen the movie Titanic, heard about the unsinkable Molly Brown, right? The character played by Kathy Bateman in that movie. She was offensive to a lot of the other rich characters in there. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that she exhibited behaviors judged to be typical of lower class people. So she was somewhat ridiculed for that. Now, she had enough money not to really be sanctioned legally, but sometimes that could happen. You could be kicked out of a prestigious club if you didn't understand proper etiquette, as it were. Okay. Is stratification universal? To a certain extent, yes. Stratification is what we refer to as one of the cultural universals. There's inequality that exists in all societies. So getting to the functionalist view, social inequality is necessary for society because that's what provides the motivation for people to work, to better themselves. If particular important positions have status, prestige, class, benefits to them, people will be motivated to work hard to get to those positions. That goes so far to explaining part of the social inequality. But over the last 30 years, the gap between the rich and the poor in this country has grown at a fantastic rate. In 1970, the average CEO made roughly 30 times what the average worker in that particular company would have made. At this point in time, the average CEO makes over 350 times what the average worker makes, and sometimes the disparities are even greater. Human beings are in competition over limited amounts of resources. Within a society, wealth, status, power are limited resources. There's only so much to go around. This creates tension between people as they compete for these. That's essentially the conflict view. Stratification itself is a major source of that tension because of practices according to conflict view like inheritance, which creates almost castes. If you are one of the ultra rich in America, you're never going to have to worry about poverty, and you don't really even have an understanding. Conflict theorists believe that through practices like inheritance, we're actually creating an estate system. We're creating a class of aristocrats in the U.S. society. Inevitably, according to conflict theory, this will lead to the revolution. If we look at the Occupy Wall Street movement, in a certain sense, that can be viewed as a Marxist movement. It's about wealth redistribution. They're protesting the 2% that control the majority of wealth in the United States of America. However, because of what would be called a dominant ideology, the idea that we're a meritocracy, that everybody in the U.S. gets to where they are in life through their own hard work, effort, and individual merits, a majority of people don't see any problem with social inequality in the U.S. The idea that I could be one of the rich keeps me from protesting against the ultra-rich. So because of that particular belief and value, that protects the interests of the people who already have accumulated all the wealth. Even though some of that was done through slavery, through exploitation, through some practices that would be considered illegal in the current period. Yet there has been no wealth redistribution. Gerhard Lenski has the idea of sociocultural evolution. As a society advances in its technology, it is technological sophistication that enables a society to begin producing surpluses in more and more areas. The first technological sophistication or innovation that produced a surplus was when we began agriculture as a widespread practice. When we began clearing land to plant specific crops such as grains, these grains can be stored. That's an asset. It's something that's stored for the future. It becomes a surplus. But the emergence of surplus resources expands the possibility for inequality. In a society that cannot store its surpluses, you either consume everything or you let it spoil, essentially. In a hunter-gatherer society, there are no surpluses. Everything's eaten immediately. And if you have extra, you share with your friends because you hope that they'll share with you next time around. But as surplus becomes possible, then you begin to see social inequality increasing. The allocation reinforces the social inequality. If I have a farm and I produce more food than I need, I can share it with my neighbors, but I can also share it with my neighbors and say, now you owe me something, in a barter society. And then if we have advanced to a monetized society where we're using money for exchange, I don't just give the surplus away. I begin selling it. And that just reinforces and expands the social inequality. Okay. When we look at stratification from the objective method, class is viewed largely as a statistical category. These are some of the things that play into your objective class. When we talk about statistical category, in certain classes, say upper middle class, we tend to see professions who are highly educated, have larger incomes, and live in nicer areas. So, how does this come about? As I said, prestige is the respect and admiration a particular occupation is held in. Different occupations command different amounts of prestige. And according to Max Weber, then they also command different amounts of capital in the market. One of the reasons that college professor is a high prestige occupation is because the work done at colleges has value in the marketplace. Esteem, of course, is a little bit different than that. That is the reputation a particular person has developed within an occupational field. You're at Ivy Tech. Do you think all of your professors that you've had do the same job? You probably think some of them are better than others. And when you move on, you'll find this, in all different types of jobs. Some people have better reputations than other people within particular occupations because of a work ethic, hard work, for whatever reason. That is esteem. Now, if we think about the way that gender plays into this, if we bring the feminist perspective into this, let's take a profession like the medical field. What's the highest status occupation within the medical field? Doctor, right? What's the overwhelming gender of doctors? Male. What is a lower status occupation that is overwhelmingly female? Nursing, right? Nurses actually do more of the work. They are with the patients more. If you're in the hospital, you may be lucky to see your doctor 15, 20 minutes a day, but you see your nurses all the time. So gender divisions play into prestige of occupations. Occupations that tend to be male-dominated tend to be higher prestige, or have traditionally been male-dominated, tend to be higher prestige. Within the field of education, college level and above, you see the traditional arrangement is that the majority of people at the educating at the college level and above is male. As you go down from there through secondary to primary, it changes over and shifts from male to female. In elementary school, the overwhelming majority of teachers tend to be female. The higher prestige occupation within the field of education is college professor instead of kindergarten teacher, for example. But for many years, this was kind of ignored. Social class studies did not pay attention to the occupations and incomes of women as determinants of social rank. And when they did begin looking into this, they found that women, occupational fields dominated by women, tended to be much lower in prestige. So, I mentioned socioeconomic status, right? There's more than one measure of how your status in society is determined. And this is a socioeconomic status indicates that there's a social component to it. Your social class is based not just on your income, it's based upon your income, your education, and your occupation. So my socioeconomic status is actually higher than my income alone would indicate. somebody working in the restaurant business as a manager of a fast food restaurant who made similar money to what I make would not be as high in socioeconomic status, because I also have an advanced education and an occupation that has higher prestige. That's how that all kind of plays out. So, income, if we remember, income is salary, wages, and other monies that you bring in on a yearly basis. In the U.S., it tends to be distributed unevenly. We've talked about that. I told you I was going to, the disparity between CEO income and income of workers tends to be at about 300 times. There is one particular company where in 2005 the CEO made 2,000 times what the average worker made, over 2,000 times, and that was Walmart. In 2005, the average worker made $13,600 at Walmart. That's the average of wages across all the workers there, including managers. At the same year, in the same year, the CEO made close to $28 million. Take $28 million, divide it by 52 for 52 weeks in the year, divide that by 40 for 40 hours per week, and we'll grant them that they work 40 hours per week, and we'll say that they worked all 52 weeks in the year. You come up with right around $13,100. So in 1 hour, the CEO made what the average, just a few $100s less than the average worker made in a year. So now, what's 50 times 4, or 52 times 40? Over 2,000, right? So 2,000 times what the average worker makes. It's also distributed unevenly along the basis of race and ethnicity. African Americans and Hispanics tend to make less. And during the recession, they will be harder hit. This example right here, median household wealth of Hispanic and Black Americans fell 27%, while white household wealth grew 2%. That's not during the Great Recession that just happened. That was during the recession of 1999-2001. Income is distributed unevenly. Wealth is distributed even more unevenly. Roughly 80%, somewhere around 77% of the income in the United States of America is generated by the top 25% of earners. When we look at wealth, the disparity is even greater. 85% of the wealth in the United States of America is owned by about 15% of the people. Half the population controls more than 97% of the wealth. Okay, thinking about poverty. There's two measures. We've got this idea of absolute poverty and relative poverty. Absolute poverty means you do not have enough resources to meet your daily needs. You have to choose sometimes between food and shelter, food and clothing, so on and so on. And you are insecure about where your next meal is coming from, and you do not have enough resources to provide for you and or your family. The government has an official definition of poverty. It's roughly $22,000 for a family of 4. If you think about that, that's kind of ludicrous, because a family of 4 living on less than $30,000 a year is making hard choices. Do I buy food for the family, or do I get medical care for the family? Do I buy food for the family, or do I buy new clothes for the family? So living below the government's poverty line, you're assumed to be living close to absolute poverty. Relative poverty is a little bit different. That's just being poor in relation to the average in your society. Not having cable TV and a nice big flat screen TV and a laptop and a smartphone and a tablet and a car. You may be able to provide food, shelter, clothing, but you're poor relative to the rest of society. Who are the poor? It says 2009, 36% of poor working adults worked full-time. That has grown slightly. Somewhere around 80% of people that are considered living in poverty are what they call working poor, people who work 40 hours a week or more. But that has been hit by temporary jobs, things like that. But yeah, people who live in poverty are not all on welfare. A lot of them work. But in 2009, about 36% of poor working adults work full-time compared to 65% of all adults. Feminization of poverty, this really refers to the idea that women are increasingly making up a larger and larger percentage of people living in poverty. When divorce happens, children tend to go with the mother. In our society still, the lion's share of income and wealth tends to go with the father. This is a trend that's been going on as divorce has become more prevalent and single-parent households become more prevalent. So since World War II, an increasing percentage of women, or increasing percentage of the poor, are women. I mentioned the underclass. This is where you find generational poverty. Poverty that continues from generation to generation to generation. Long-term poor, they really don't have education, skills, anything like that. They're unaware oftentimes of paths to even get education. A lot of times they wind up not even completing high school as they begin to look for work to help the family out. But poverty is not a static social class. Right now, there's a strong kind of downward pull in our society as more and more people are slipping from the middle class into the lower class. Herbert Gans kind of looked at the functions of poverty. Working for charity can make a person feel very good about themselves. Working at a food pantry, this kind of stuff. So Gans says poverty and the poor satisfy some important functions for non-poor groups. One of the things, of course, is we all love going to our restaurants. We like the fast food restaurants here in the U.S. Regardless of whether or not we're willing to admit it, we all like going to McDonald's or Burger King or whichever one you have. Society's dirty work performed at a low cost. Creates jobs that serve the poor. Upholds conventional social norms. The idea of poverty makes you believe, I don't want to be poor, I better work hard and get an education. Guarantees the higher status of people who are not living in poverty. And then when we talk about social change, oftentimes it's the poor who get hit hardest by certain types of social change. Max Weber had this idea of what he called life chances. Life chances are opportunities for obtaining material goods, positive living conditions, and favorable life experiences. This is related closely to social class. Occupying a high social position improves a person's life chances. On average, people from the upper class tend to live 7 years longer than people from the middle and lower classes. I just kind of went through that, didn't I? Okay. When we go through recessions, the rich are hit less hard. They have an opportunity to avoid danger. for example, right now, Ebola is becoming a big concern with the tracking of a few cases of Ebola in the U.S. and now the first case of somebody who actually contracted it in the U.S. If you are among the affluent in society, the chances of you contracting Ebola through casual random encounter is much, much lower than it is for somebody from the working or poor class or lower class. I mentioned social mobility, the idea of moving through strata. Social mobility is more likely to be found in an open system than a closed system. A class system where it kind of emphasizes achieved status, right? Rather than a caste system which emphasizes ascribed status. So an open system would be a class system. Position of each individual can be influenced by the person's choice of occupation, managing to acquire education. You can actually move up or down depending on your own choices, your own achieved statuses. Closed system is where it is you're born an untouchable, you live as an untouchable, you die an untouchable. There's little or no possibility of moving up. To a certain extent, even though we have the idea of an open system here in the United States of America, race and ethnicity and gender play into that, creating fewer opportunities for social mobility, for upward social mobility for people in a minority status group. Horizontal mobility is movement within the same range of prestige. When you may find a different job, but within the same industry in which you've been working, maybe for slightly more money, you might be making a little bit more money, but in a certain sense, that's kind of horizontal mobility because you haven't changed your socioeconomic status substantially. Vertical mobility is when you move up and down through strata within a system of stratification. Movement from one position to another of a different rank, maybe through promotion, moving from worker into management, and eventually moving your way up. What's her name? Michelle Barra, Mary Barra. I can't remember. Her last name is Barra. I know that. The new CEO of GM, who worked, her father was a die caster for GM. And she worked for GM. She's been there for 34 years. At CEO, she has moved from one position to another. She's had vertical social mobility. Now, she got a college education and, some other things went, but that's definite vertical mobility. That would be an example of what we would call intra-generational mobility, social position changes within a person's adult life. The other type of social mobility, which would be intergenerational mobility, is the difference between Ms. Barra and her father, where you have a change between generations. So you can achieve social mobility. I just gave you an example of what you would call occupational mobility. There's also the impact of education. Race and ethnicity can put barriers in your way, or if you are the correct race and ethnicity, can actually open doors for you. Gender, the effects are lessening, but there is still what we would call the glass ceiling as far as race, ethnicity, and gender for minority status, where advancement beyond a certain point has almost insurmountable barriers. So, yeah, if we take a look at executive compensation, I gave you some of these figures already. In 1965, top executives earned 24 times the average worker's pay. By 1980, it had widened to 40 times, and then, as I said, it's over 300 times now. The gap is 300 times the average. So, how would we look at this from a sociological perspective? If the executives enhance the position of the company within the economy, compensation is reasonable given that particular potential. Conflict would look at it a little differently. They would question the idea that anybody's labor can be worth that much money. It's hard to believe that anybody's labor is worth 300 times somebody else's labor. So they would question the process that actually leads to those types of outcomes. Corporations tend to report executives, according to Dupret, corporations report executives' compensations relative to peer compensation. So we compare apples to apples instead of apples to oranges, as they would say. You may hear one type, like a CEO of a public versus or a nonprofit versus a profit. That's one where you may see some disparity that they actually discuss. But public comparisons of executive compensations has an influence on this. It may influence the board decision on how much to compensate if they realize that other companies are paying more or paying less, although the trend recently has been paying more. There's a law now that mandates companies publish table showing how much CEOs and other executives are being compensated. We haven't gotten a law that limits, as a function of the average worker, how much executives can be compensated. They have laws like that in Europe. Because of the recession and because of the practices that led to it, there is a Treasury Department official that has been tasked with examining executive compensation to try and determine if there's a way for it to be regulated. Critics of that particular decision just really say, if you don't do it that way, they're going to find another way to, they'll give them traveling expenses, they'll give them expense accounts, things like that. Okay, so that is our look at Chapter 9. Now we are going to begin Chapter 10, Global Inequality. This is a little bit shorter chapter, so should not take quite as long. Some of the things we're going to be looking at: the global divide, stratification in the world system, stratification within nations, comparing. Take a look. I'm actually probably not going to take a look at the stratification in Mexico, but we may look at social policy and global inequality. So, some of the questions we're going to be addressing. What economic and political conditions explain the divide between rich and poor nations? How are wealth and income distributed within developing nations? How much opportunity does the average worker have to move up the social ladder? And there is, within developing nations, what can be called structural social mobility, where there are large numbers of opportunities available. And how do race and gender affect social mobility in these countries? As we discussed, inequality exists in almost every society. And it can be, from the functionalist perspective, the motivation for people to act, to try to lessen or try to increase their social standing. Inequality is a significant determinant of human behavior. Divides in global wealth, from a certain perspective, emerged as a result of the Industrial Revolution and rising agricultural productivity. As we applied science to the production of grains in the United States of America during the 50s, we took the yield we were getting on, say, corn from 20 bushels an acre to over 200 bushels an acre. So we were producing a lot more corn, and we could sell that off. That was a surplus that became of value to the U.S., and we created wheat surpluses in the same way. So the Industrial Revolution, when we gained the ability to apply technology to the production of agricultural products, kind of created a greater divide in global wealth. Part of the problem, of course, is that standards of living in the Northern Hemisphere for the European and American, North American and European countries rose substantially, while the standard of living in countries along the equator and in the Southern Hemisphere, with the exception maybe of Australia and New Zealand, did not rise in the same way. So the rise in living standards, because of the Industrial Revolution, were confined to high-income nations that were at the leading edge of the industrialization. And during the Industrial Revolution, this was also the time when European exploration and colonization was at its height, and those countries were essentially taking resources and exploiting the peoples of their colonies, and they were extracting resources out of these nations. So what we see now is, over the last 500 years, global inequality has increased dramatically. And there's a stark contrast between the industrialized nations, the high-income industrialized nations, and the agricultural low-income nations, or what we refer to maybe as developing nations. Some of this, of course, is the legacy of colonialism, but multinational corporations continue to practice what is called neocolonialism, which is economic colonization. They go into countries where paying $1 an hour seems like a good wage, and they exploit the workers in order to economically, or from an economic perspective, extract labor out. Of course, modernization is something that's going on in certain nations right now, but it brings with it its own Pandora's box of problems. So looking at these particular things, the legacy of colonialism. Colonialism itself is essentially dominance of another society by foreign invaders through force, because they have maybe superior technology. So they maintain political, social, economic, and cultural domination for an extended period. In some cases, up into the 20th century, parts of Africa were still under the control of European nations. And into the 20th century, parts of China and Indochina as well. In fact, Hong Kong remained under British control up until about 1997. We mentioned neocolonialism and how multinational corporations play into this, but this is essentially the continued dependence on the industrialized nations by developing nations, because there has been no educational program to teach them how to run the businesses and how to run the agriculture and how to run everything that was being done by the colonizers. Emanuel Wallerstein created this idea of world systems analysis, where he looks at the relationship, and this is from a conflict perspective, of high-income nations and low-income nations as an unequal economic and political relationship. Industrialized nations dominate the core of the world's economic system and continue to exploit the underdeveloped nations. This comes out of, or is similar to what we would call dependence theory as opposed to modernization theory. These are two conflict approaches, world systems analysis and dependence theory. Dependence theory maintains that even as developing countries make economic advances, they are still being exploited and continue to have to rely on the core nations and corporations, the high-income players in the global economy. Globalization itself is the process whereby the economies, political institutions, and cultures of the world are becoming increasingly interconnected and intertwined. Through trade and exchange of ideas, we're moving closer and closer to Well, we've already really gotten to a global economy. When we went through the Great Recession beginning in about 2007 here in the U.S., it rocked the economies of other nations of the world as well. Multinational corporations operating in multiple nations. That's really contained right in the name there. They may be headquartered in a particular country, but they're doing business throughout the world. And they don't really owe allegiance to any one country. Recently, some of the practices of multinational corporations have come under scrutiny. One of the earlier practices was the idea of offshoring or outsourcing. Walmart gets products made in its factories in China. That's how come you get the $400 40-inch TV at Walmart, because it's being manufactured by somebody getting paid $1 an hour in China. In the Chinese economy, honestly, $1 an hour is good money. It gives you disposable income. If you're getting a US dollar an hour, that's pretty high pay for China. But yeah, another practice recently is where a multinational corporation or a corporation that's headquartered here in the U.S. will transfer ownership to a foreign subsidy in order to avoid paying U.S. corporate taxes. You may have heard it referred to as tax inversion. A lot of people view it as tax evasion, really. Walmart, as a company, is a player on a global scale. They control goods and services, and if you talked about their gross domestic product, their GDP, it's on a par with most of the nations of the world. All but 20 of the nations of the world make less than Walmart in total revenue. I think they're like equal with Belgium. So for a company, that's pretty big player on the scene. More than 10% of U.S. goods and services related to export or import of goods through multinational businesses. Now, functionalist view says they can help developing nations in the same way that high-income nations can help developing nations as well. This is what would be called modernization theory. They provide jobs in industry, they reduce costs, boost profits, and take maximum advantage of technological innovations. They make nations more interdependent and less likely to enter conflicts. If we're trade partners, we have economic reasons to maintain good political relations, essentially. So when we look at multinational corporations and we look at nations, high-income nations from a functionalist perspective, which would be modernization theory, the relationship is actually beneficial to both nations because the high-income nation is getting goods at a lower cost, and the low-income nation is getting jobs and education and industry. Conflict view, this again would be dependence theory. Multinational corporations exploit local workers to maximize profits. Initially, it may seem beneficial to both the company and the country, but it eventually increases economic inequality within developing nations because they hire executives to manufacture the plant or to manage the plants in which manufacturing is going on, or they hire foremen to supervise, and these people tend to accumulate wealth for themselves. When we talk about being poor in the United States of America, in no way does it compare with being poor on a global scale. There is a reference to what is called the bottom billion. There are roughly 7.3 billion people in the world. Roughly 1 billion of those people do not know where their next meal is coming from. If industrial nations could give 0.5%, essentially, of their gross national product for developing nations, which is what the Millennium Project asked, this would eliminate extreme poverty, hopefully by next year. I don't know if it's happening. I need to look into that. Denmark, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden are countries that have decided to do this. Privileged people tend to make the assumption that world's poor lack assets. This may not be entirely true. Okay, I mentioned this a little bit, the idea of modernization theory. Peripheral nations, because you've got the core, semi-periphery, and the periphery. When we look at like nations, the core are the high-income industrialized nations, semi-periphery are the middle-income industrializing nations, and the periphery nations are the low-income, what you would call the developing nations, the nations that are poor. And modernization is a process through which peripheral nations acquire education and technology, move from traditional institutions to those characteristic of a more developed society. Modernization, according to modernization theory, will gradually improve the lives of people in developing nations. The development of periphery countries will be assisted by innovations transferred from the industrialized world. Worldwide, the 2% of adults own more than half of the world's household wealth. In at least 24 nations, 10% of the population receives at least 40% of all the income. When you hear about like a champagne glass distribution, if you think about a cross-sectional look at a champagne glass and then you put 5 sections from top to bottom along the champagne glass, that's a good way of looking at the wealth of the world. The top is where most of it is contained. So the top 20% has something like 80 or 85% of the nation's of the world's wealth. And then as you come down to the stem, you see the second 20%, they're not horribly well off, but by the time you get to the bottom, they're existing on almost nothing. Intergenerational mobility in industrialized nations. As nations go through the industrialization process, it creates what's called structural mobility. But patterns of intergenerational mobility in industrialized nations include similarities in the way parents' positions in stratification systems are transmitted to children. One of the things that when we get to the chapter on education, people may, according to the hidden curriculum, be taught class-based values. But I talked about structural social mobility. When industrialization is our nation is undergoing industrialization, it creates what's called structural social mobility. Opportunities for people to improve, and a large number of people to improve their standing in society. Immigration can be a significant factor in shaping intergenerational mobility. Immigrants tend to be reasonably poor when they come in, but with an emphasis on education, their children can do much, much better. We talk about mobility in developing nations, large-scale changes, social and economic changes, often overshadow micro or small-scale movement from one occupation to another. As countries develop and modernize, women's vital role in food production deteriorates. So women actually experience sort of a downward social mobility as you apply essentially industry to the production of agricultural products, grain and things like that. Okay, taking a look at welfare in North America an issue. Governments in all parts of the world search for the right solution to welfare. Does it create dependence or does it help people out? We're the richest nation in the world. Nobody should go hungry in the United States of America. But a lot of times the rhetoric we hear is debating this very issue. Are we creating dependence by providing certain types of welfare? What type of welfare should we provide? Should it be training? Should it be resources? How much should be provided? How much is too much? How much is not enough? Regardless of some of the rhetoric you may hear, nobody is buying lobster on food stamps. If they are, they're committing fraud, essentially, because most of the people on food stamps, if not all the people on food stamps are not enough to support one person. Every time somebody has said, well, I could live on food stamps, they try it and they fail if they come from the middle class or up. How much responsibility? How long should we provide it? Should they have to be getting training or looking for a job if they're getting welfare? These are all questions that come up. Personal responsibility and work opportunity reconciliation passed in the U.S. in 1996. This is when long-term welfare was eliminated in the U.S. Now I think it's a maximum of 2 years. You can actually receive that. But that particular act ended long-standing federal guarantee of assistance. It essentially changed welfare in this country. It changed it substantially. As far as the U.S., the social safety nets that the U.S. provides, they are very, very small compared to the rest of the high-income nations. Germany, most of Europe, England, Japan, all the other high-income industrialized nations in the world provide a lot more in housing, Social Security, welfare, health care, and unemployment than the U.S. does. But that is actually pointed to by some of the opponents of welfare because they create generational welfare recipients to a certain extent. So what can sociology do? Well, first of all, as I said, in the richest nation in the world, nobody should be going hungry. Nobody should be starving. So many sociologists view the debate over welfare from a conflict perspective. The backlash against welfare recipients reflects deep fears and hostilities towards racial and ethnic minorities. Because the idea of a welfare mother is primarily a racial stereotype. 90% of the welfare paid out in this country is what you would call corporate welfare, okay? So when we think about welfare in this country, we tend to think about it as an individual thing for people. But tax breaks, direct payments, and grants government makes to corporations make up 90% of the welfare in the U.S. One of the policy changes, as I said, was the idea of welfare back to work, or what they call workfare. We provide money, we provide food, but only for a limited period of time, and the idea is that they're supposed to get training to get a job. So the jury's still out on whether or not that works. Prospects for hardcore jobless faded, especially when we began the Great Recession. There are jobs being created, but what kind of jobs is another question. When we look at what happened with Europe in the welfare programs, as far as policy here, Europeans don't want to be taxed any more than Americans do. In North America and Europe, people turn to private means for support. So when we look at applying policy, we have to kind of think about how we're going to do this in a way that benefits everybody, in a way that everybody can be happy with. Okay, this concludes our discussion of chapters 9 and 10. I hope you find these beneficial if you're listening to these. Next week, we will cover Chapter 11. We'll be at the same time. It'll be 1:30 Central Standard Time, 2:30 Eastern Standard Time. And we'll go until about 3. I usually wait a few minutes before beginning the lecture to see if anybody's going to show up. If you do show up, there is a chat box where you can ask questions during the lecture, and I'll be more than happy to answer the questions you have. So until next week, everybody have a good week. And as I said, I hope you find this beneficial, and I hope you enjoy these. Bye.